Toy Story broke new ground in computer animation, and was a massive success, especially thanks to the fact that it's actually a pretty good movie on top of that. Being a movie about toys, naturally, there's a ton of merchandise, especially toys themselves, and I was one of the many kids who would have a Woody and a Buzz. I mean, honestly, the toys alone were cool enough to want as a kid, even without the film.
Buzz Lightyear. His new spacesuit protects him from evil proton rays and comes equipped with a flip-up arm communicator.
Buzz Lightyear to the rescue!
Firing missiles on target!
And naturally, with it being such a successful franchise for such a long time, we've got a bunch of video games to look at today. The first game, based on the first movie, was first released on the Sega Mega Drive or Genesis, coinciding with the release of the movie, which, believe it or not, wasn't standard practice at the time. The game eventually found its way to the Super Nintendo, PC, Game Boy, and by 1997 there was even an unlicensed NES version. The primary 16-bit versions were developed by Traveller's Tales, but they all follow the same general idea. Now, just for reference, we're looking at the Sega version here. Most of the game will take the form of a side-scroller, but it's not your typical get from point A to point B experience. It's an objective-based game, and those objectives can vary up quite a bit. Like this stage where you have to guide all of the other toys back into the toy box, and then other stages where you have to do things like race Buzz to the end. It's all worth it though, because when you do beat a level, Woody just goes nuts. Less impressive, though doing its best, is the Game Boy version. It's pretty much emulating the 16-bit experience, but the technical limitations are pretty clear from the get-go. Controls are more delayed, it does run a lot slower, and the visuals alone can cause quite a bit of difficulty. What happened to Woody? Where'd he go? Oh, look, there he is. Some of you may have had nightmares about PS1 Hagrid. Well, I have nightmares about Game Boy Woody. With the massive popularity of Toy Story, you could pretty much guarantee two things: more movies, more games, and now we're going to move on to the PS1, where we see a few games come out actually, starting with Toy Story 2, obviously based on the movie. Traveller's Tales are still at the helm, and in many ways it shares a lot in common with its predecessor, just updated into the third dimension. Once again, we get a platformer, following the plot of the movie, where you interact with other toys throughout detailed levels based on settings from the film. This time we're playing as Buzz Lightyear, with the story told through FMV scenes pulled from the movie, which was a pretty big deal for the time. FMV files were large, and home video releases took a lot longer to come out back then. Do take note that the N64 version couldn't even include these videos because of the limited space on the cartridges. The stages themselves really stand out. They're great visual representatives of their respective scenes from the movie. It's a colourful game with cool little details, like when you can see the reflection of Buzz's face on his visor when you go into first person. I love little things like that because it just shows how much thought was being put into the development of the game. Whilst it's a fairly typical platforming experience for the time, it is still pretty solid. Levels are open plan, the main collectibles are Pizza Planet tokens, which are needed to unlock the later levels in the game, and you can get these tokens by completing objectives on behalf of other toys. Some are hidden in the level. It's pretty standard stuff. Buzz can double jump, and is also equipped with a spin attack and his wrist laser. Both attacks can be charged up to release a more powerful version, and there's an upgrade you can get for the laser in each stage. The only thing it really begs for is a better way to control the camera. The L2 and R2 buttons will slowly move both Buzz and the camera, which is better than nothing, but it's not really made well for more fast-paced sequences. Meanwhile, you've got the right analog stick right there, remaining unused. This is actually a pretty cool little game. There's something about being shrunken down to the size of a toy and exploring all of the scenes from the film, which, I don't know, I just kinda like. But even better than that, there's a Game Boy version. So technically speaking, this is a Game Boy Color version. And as you can expect, it's a totally different game. Developed by Tiertex Design Studios, our friends that brought us Game Boy Woody. Well, fear not, because now it's about Game Boy Color Buzz. We're back to being a side-scroller for the handheld, and it's a more simple affair of getting from point A to point B this time. The environments all look pretty detailed. It's certainly a better looking game than Toy Story on Game Boy, but sadly it's a lot less interactive than before. Why can I not bounce on this ball? How do I get this coin? I don't even know what it's for, but it's right there, so I want it. It's also starting to suffer from the lack of buttons on the Game Boy. Having to use the same button to run and jump is a little bit awkward. You need to come to a total standstill in order to have any precision in your jumps. Then you have to wait for Buzz to bend his knees, and yeah, there we go. Buzz must be getting old because that looked painful. So yeah, it's one hell of a delay between tapping a button and getting the action. It's the same with pretty much everything else too. With Laser, he has to slowly lift his arm into position. And look, I do appreciate the more elaborate animation for an 8-bit title, but at this point it's at the expense of gameplay. So yeah, if you couldn't already tell, Toy Story 2 on Game Boy Color doesn't exactly live up to its PS1 counterpart. So if you happened to be watching Saturday morning cartoons in late 2000 for a very specific brief time period, you may remember the cartoon Buzz Lightyear of Star Command. It followed Buzz as the character, not the toy, going around fighting Zurg and doing his Buzz Lightyear-y things. And why am I talking about it? I think you've guessed. Yeah, there was a video game of it. Let's check it out. Okay, first point I want to make quickly is I didn't even notice the word "of" in the title. Until I started making this video, I thought it was just called Buzz Lightyear Star Command. But then again, I never really did watch the cartoon. And speaking of, did you know the game actually predates the show? The US release date for the game is around a week before the show actually aired. Huh. The mission select screen is pretty cool, and you get animated cutscenes between each level. But damn, could they be any shorter?
Outstanding job, Rangers! You can always count on us, sir.
I get it's likely to try and save some space, but they literally cut off mid-sentence.
I am unimpressed.
Are we really saying we couldn't have that extra half second? But then sometimes you'll get a scene like this, where Buzz is talking to one of the villains about how she'll find the right man.
You cannot bend the will of men. Gravatina, you're a very, very evil lady, but somewhere there's a fellow who thinks evil and a great big head are just about the best things a girl could have. Really? Well, sure.
It's quite weird, and for some reason lasts way longer than any other cutscene. Why?
And in the meantime, keep that pretty little nose of yours clean.
Okay, Buzz, let's run through some of the basics. You start with a standard issue laser. Any add-ons are going to cost you some Galactic Alliance credits, or GACs for short. Now, Buzz, your mission in each level is to arrest the bad guy. You can't beat the criminals early. You can only make an arrest at their getaway spot. Buzz, along the way, save as many of the LGMs as you can. Now, Buzz, your mission in each level is to arrest the bad guy. Simple enough, right? Wrong! You can't arrest the bad guys until you reach their getaway spot. Track them to the getaway spot and stop them. If the bad guys get to their getaway spot before you, you only have 15 seconds to catch up with them. Otherwise, you lose, Ranger. If you get to the getaway spot before the criminals, Mirror will be there to reward your efforts.
Stop! In the name of Star Command! Sorry, no can do, Lightyear.
After all that, we're on a farm? So to be fair, the other levels are a little bit more exciting. The goal is to chase the bad guy to the end of the level, and then you fight them. Little bit different to your average platformer. It's kinda cool that you get introduced to the boss of each stage at the very start of it.
Feed me energy, human. I can see that we'll have to do this the hard way.
Controls, little bit awkward. Aiming your weapon by trying to move clunky old Buzz into position is a little frustrating, and we're still with the same developer, so how have we managed to take a step backwards in this regards? Toy Buzz is more capable than the actual Buzz Lightyear. We once again have a form of tokens to collect, this time galactic tokens. You spend the tokens when you pick up a new power-up, weapon or vehicle. It's not a bad idea, it's at least more interesting than the standard collect 100, get an extra life that's been done to death. You need to treat every stage like it's a racetrack. If the villain makes it to the end first, you only get a very small window of time before it's game over. Your best bet is just ignore everything until the very end. You get given everything you need for the final boss battles in the last area where the boss is anyway. Plus, all of it will respawn, so you'll never run out. That, or a random bomb thing, will just go off and kill you anyway. I don't know, this one just feels a little bit too chaotic. Not in a good way either, in a what the hell is going on kind of way. Like if you want to feel like a badass Buzz Lightyear, there are better options. But there is one thing, and that's a Game Boy version. It all looks the part as best as a Game Boy Color game can, even down to the menu screens and mission brief. Okay, Lightyear. Here are the basics. Get to the end of... Oh my god. Could they not have made the text any faster? Let's save ourselves some time. The goal is exactly the same. You race to the finish and fight the bad guy at the end, with each level being a direct translation of the PS1 counterpart, at least from what I played of it anyway. And as you can see, we have something that's not a side-scroller. Instead, it's a top-down view. It doesn't always work well when you need to do things like jump across platforms, or pick up out-of-reach items. Also now you can only collect 5 coins at a time, which still work in pretty much the same way as before. Also, like on the PS1, it does end up just easier ignoring everything and rushing to the end. Buzz is also incapable of looking backwards. If you did feel the need to backtrack, you have to slowly shuffle backwards. It's easier to just let whatever you missed go and move on. Maybe they should have just focused on making this a little more run and gun style, as opposed to trying to clumsily mimic the PS1 game beat for beat. I know that we've got to that stage in the video now where you guys have some pretty burning questions in your mind, and don't worry, I'm fully aware of them, so let's just get it out of the way now. Who would win a race? Buzz Lightyear or Woody? Well, thankfully, Toy Story Racer is here to answer those questions. Well, if you couldn't tell, I went into this not expecting much, but I gotta say, I'm pleasantly surprised. Toy Story Racer is packed with content and variety. First things first, the controls are very simple. Even more simple than your average kart racer. Forward, reverse, fire your weapon. That's it. That's everything. It's clearly made with kids in mind, so don't go expecting any drift mechanics here or anything complicated. But for a game like this, it works well enough and is easily accessible. The tracks are actually pretty neat. Plenty of settings from the movie, which are fun to race through. They can even get quite complex. I found it maybe a little too easy to get lost in a couple of them. A map of the track akin to other racers would have been handy. But it's not the end of the world. The tracks are short enough to memorise quickly, and the game is very forgiving if you do mess up. There's a lot more to it than just racing though. The main goal is to collect toy soldiers. And how do you get them? Well, first off, you select a character. Then you get access to their challenge tower. Yeah, like Mortal Kombat. Each brick here is a challenge, with more soldiers being required to unlock higher challenges in the tower, and also to unlock more characters to play as. These challenges range from traditional races, to endurance races, elimination races, reverse races, and combat-based modes too. Yes, this is a Toy Story game that features vehicular combat death matches, and it's awesome. Toy Story Racer. A good game with a lot of replay value and a lot of attention to detail. And a Game Boy version. Hey, visually, for a Game Boy Color game, this is pretty ambitious. There's only a couple of modes to play, Tournament and Quick Race, both being exactly what you'd expect. You don't get weapons this time around, likely due to the lack of buttons. So instead we get pickups that have immediate effects, though from what I played, most of them seem to hinder you instead of help. The worst of which is the damn steering wheel. Every race I ran into multiple of these. It forces you to turn right. For a good 5 to 10 seconds, it's so annoying. The other races can't even be affected by it. That's not fair. There's a bunch of coins all over the track, but I have no idea what they actually do. I just collect them because it feels like the right thing to do. The way the tracks work is kind of odd. You have to do 2 laps for it to count as 1 lap, like a kind of artificial way of making the track seem longer. At first I thought I was going insane until I realised what was going on. It's not an awful game really, just limited by the system and some very odd design choices. Time to move up a level. We now move forward quite a few years before we see our next Toy Story game, Toy Story 3, which has been released on quite a few systems, but I'm going to start with the PS3 version of the game since it was the current generation at the time and is generally considered the sort of main version of the game. Toy Story 3 is actually an interesting case for a movie licensed game. It's made up of two halves, and I don't mean a first half and a second half. No, I mean more like you've got two games for the price of one. You've got the expected story mode, loosely following the plot of the movie in a fairly linear fashion. Even here though, each of the levels takes a fairly different form, and gameplay can vary quite a bit. For the most part, it's a platformer, with a focus more towards puzzles and problem solving when playing as toys in the real world, and then more towards action when levels are based in fantasy imagination settings. Each toy has their own unique abilities, and often you'll have to switch between them and work together in order to progress. In the imagination-based fantasy stages, they gain more abilities that suit the character, like Buzz's laser, and Woody causing chaos by launching into things recklessly with his massive head. Anyway, Buzz's video game stage was a real highlight. It's surprisingly faithful to the game that you see Rex playing in Toy Story 2. It's cool to see such effort put into level design for a game of this nature. Naturally, there are collectibles littered throughout, many of which contributing to the other side of Toy Story 3, Toy Town.
I, Mayor Ham, hereby make you the Sheriff of Woody's Roundup. Congratulations! You're now in charge of bringing order and prosperity to our town. So, bring in some gold and new toys to spruce up the place. Come on, get a move on.
And whilst the story mode is decent fun, Toy Town is where the real game is at. It's a large free roam area, complete with MMO-style quests. I mean, yeah, look at them. You've got exclamation marks, you have to do things like collect X amount of something. Just like an MMO, it's kind of addictive. It's easy to lose hours exploring and expanding Toy Town, as progressing with missions will unlock new buildings and inhabitants to purchase for the town. Each one offers their own unique tasks and minigames to complete, as well as, of course, more missions, which leads to more expansion, and so on. Those collectibles I mentioned in story mode lead to even more toys for Toy Town. As it expands, it really starts to show far more depth and just sheer levels of content than what you would usually expect from a kids' movie video game.
Ladies and gentlemen, my opponent claims that I am unclear on the issues, but can any of you even understand a single word he said? That accusation was as inaccurate and incomplete as it was incoherent. I'm shocked that you would say such things in front of the decent, humble inhabitants of this fair town.
And honestly, in my opinion, this could be one of the best examples of that little subgenre.
So, we meet again, Buzz Lightyear, for the last time.
No counter, sir.
This force field to the dead.
But what about the other versions of the game? We've still got the PSP and PS2 versions to look at. Well, when you dip down a generation to the PS2, it's a totally different game. Now it's primarily a platformer, and a pretty basic one at that, even compared to some of the older titles. The main game mode follows a simple version of the movie's story, with pretty linear levels to get through. Jump, hit things, and occasionally interact with something. You get the idea. It's not bad, just a little bit lackluster. The levels do have their own unique collectibles, but they don't amount to much, just leading up to unlocking some artwork. It suffers from annoying camera-itis too. You can control the camera, but only sometimes. Half the time it just stays fixed, so it begs the question, why bother? No Toy Town in this version, which is a shame but not a surprise. Instead you get some bonus levels for Woody and Buzz, both focusing on the actual characters as opposed to their toy versions. Woody's Roundup is like an endless runner. It just reminds me of the dinosaur game on Google Chrome, except somehow it's more annoying. Doesn't quite feel precise enough, but it's achievable, and worth playing if only for the satisfying thud Woody makes when he smacks into something. Damn, he got smacked. As for Buzz's mode, it's very similar to previous Buzz-focused gameplay we've seen before. Jump around sci-fi environments, occasionally laser one of Zurg's minions. It's okay, but it feels like a step backwards from previous Buzz games. As for the PSP version, it's almost identical to the PS2 version. It has a little bit less content, but that's because on the PSP it was DLC. That's technically because the PSP version came first, so the PS2 version is like a port of the PSP version, but you know what, who cares? I know what you all want, and that's the Game Boy... No, there's no Game Boy version of Toy Story 3, but there is a Nintendo DS version, and I mean, come on. We've come this far. And again, another completely different game from the other systems. This version was actually developed by N-Space, who made Duke Nukem, Time to Kill, plus a ton of other DS ports. I just thought that was a weird one. The DS touchscreen is quite heavily utilised, mostly to good use too, though it did feel a little awkward in some of the more fast-paced game modes. I think I'd have rather jumping had been a button than a swipe on the screen, but you do get used to it. Woody and Buzz both have their own versions of on-rail sections, which are set in playtime fantasy settings. There's also a tower defense mode, which, while not massively in-depth, is pretty fun for a kids game. And then you have the adventure mode, which has you going around completing tasks in platforming stages. Kinda reminds me of the PS1 titles, and that's not a bad thing. When you play the story mode, it takes all three different styles of gameplay and mixes them up to make one big game. It's not a massive challenge, but it does bring me back to simpler times. It's a shame this version of Toy Story 3 is often the one forgotten. It takes a different approach, and in my opinion, it does pay off. Oh, here's one I almost completely forgot to mention. Toy Story Mania on the PS3. It's a bare basic motion control game that can use either the normal controller with the analog sticks to aim, or the PlayStation Move controllers. Instead of taking advantage of new technology, it more reminds me of old light gun games, and things like the iToy games from the PS2. By the time it got its PS3 release, it was already 3 years old, so the whole novelty of motion control games had already worn off. It does have a ton of different stages, themed around different toys, but fundamentally recycling the same few mini-games, many of which can overstay their welcome. You go for a high score, compete against a friend, but you can do respectively well if you just close your eyes and flail about wildly. Even for kids, this is probably going to be a little too easy. Best left on the Nintendo Wii where it started. Well, there we have it. We're all done, and outside of the odd, simple game released for smartphones, we haven't really seen any Toy Story games for over a decade now, since Toy Story 3 came out, meaning Toy Story 4 was the first time we didn't get a Toy Story movie tie-in video game. But that kind of thing has fallen out of fashion, You don't get a game come out every time a movie comes out anymore, and that's probably for the better considering the quality they'd often end up. Although, with these Toy Story ones, they're pretty good. This is a pretty decent bunch of little games, and for me, Toy Story 2 probably wins it. That's the one I enjoy the most, but I know that's nostalgia talking. I have childhood memories of this, and it's a decent enough game, so that was always going to win for me. If you have the means to play, where is it? Here we are, Toy Story 3, that's the PS3 360 generation version, then give it a go. That's probably technically the best version, but hey, before I start rambling, that's pretty much all I have to say. That's all of Toy Story covered. The Game Boy versions were not really good enough for me to recommend, but hey, check them out if you want. Thank you for watching, and fingers crossed, maybe one day we'll see another Toy Story game.